Okay guys, we're getting started on Fiero Red's chassis now. We're already done with the test shot Fiero chassis, and we're done with Fiero Blue's chassis. So only one left is Fiero Red. So we're going to go through all the buildup of the chassis so you guys can see everything as it goes. Now, the first thing we have to do is we're going to have to mark our coolant tubes, because this time we're going to actually plan out our radiator hoses, seeing as how we already know what we need to do. Before, I just, on Fiero Blue, it was just something that just popped into my head, so I just flew with it, flying blind into it. But now I have a bit of a plan, and it's going to be a little bit easier. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the coolant pipes. We already know that under here you're not going to see where the pipes connect to the hoses. So it's not really that important that we get an exact fit of the hoses to the pipe. So we're going to snip these pipes right where they pass underneath the front subframe. If we can get it off. There we go. All right. Let's just get this off here. There we go. Just a little bit of a tight fit there. As we discovered on the last one, we're going to have to open those holes up a little bit so that everything fits snugly, but not too tight. Now, this is the mounting point for this one here. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut our coolant pipe right about here. Right about there. We may have to trim it back a little bit, but this is going to be our first cut of the coolant pipe. And we're going to go right there. Shrinks it down just a bit. And that will allow us to have our pipe disappear underneath the subframe and still give us room to install our hoses so that it looks as if they're all connected. Now we're going to do the same thing on this side. And let's make our mark right here. There we go. And now we're going to just take a little bit of a snip right there. And we'll make our adjustments as needed. And there we go. We have our pipes in basically the same area of being snipped off. We may have to trim a little bit off as we go along. So here we have the pipes that are going under the subframe, so we're good there. Alright guys, now we're just going to install the radiator cross member. You've all seen this before, so let's just fly right through this. Set that aside to dry, and now we're going to bring over our radiator, fan, and fan shroud assembly. Now, as we discussed before, the fan can be mounted right to the shroud, or if you want to leave it loose, you can actually spin the fan because it'll be trapped between the shroud and the radiator, so it would actually move if you felt like having a fan that was actually going to move. which is kind of cool, but kind of pointless. Now here we painted the fan with the aluminum of Vallejo aluminum, just lightly airbrushed over the black, which gives us this very light aluminum look with a little bit of darkness going through, almost as if it is a real radiator. Gives it a much more realistic appearance than if it had been painted straight up, aluminum. As if you look at a real radiator, you're not going to see it looking super shiny there. You'll see between the fins where it's gonna go a little dark. So that's what I tried to replicate here. Now I am gonna have to do some touch-ups. Just to cover up a little bit of the overspray. Okay, now we have our fan and radiator mount. Our fan and fan motor mount done. Now what we have to do is we have to drill our holes for our radiator hoses. Now we already know which way we're going to go. The top one's going to go straight in here, and the bottom one, it's going to have to go at an angle going upward this way in order to get it to rest at the right angle to meet the other pipe. So let's get busy drilling our holes here. And there we have our second hole. We're going to go up a little bit more. To give us a good anchoring point for our wire. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take heat shrink tubing, and what we're going to do with the heat shrink tubing is we're going to run our wire into the heat shrink tubing, and that's going to allow us to bend it and shape the heat shrink tubing to the shape that we need in order to mimic our radiator hoses. For that, we're going to need a few tools, one of which being these jewelry pliers from Home Depot. Not Home Depot, from Hobby Lobby. And our 20 gauge bead jewelry wire. And our heat shrink tubing, which is going to be the perfect diameter to give us a realistic looking hose. So the first thing we're going to do is cut a length of wire. Now that wire is going to go inserted into the radiator, like so. And we're going to bend it into the shape that we need it to be. Like our first bend is going to be here. And we're going to cut that just a bit because we want it to be bit closer to the radiator. There we go. So we have our radiator hose there. Now the tough part is going to be making this tight bend, even with the let's try going in this way, as this is where it gets a little tough, is in getting these really tight bends with the heat shrink tubing. Okay guys, sorry I had to make all these adjustments off camera because it was getting a little bit tough to do it while I'm on camera, but you can see the hoses in there now. We got rid of the kink because I had an idea that if I heat the heat shrink tubing, it'll shrink it enough to wrap it around the wire, still giving us a good looking hose and removing the kink that was in there. So now we have a nice smooth transition on that bend right at the radiator, coming down and meeting our coolant pipe. Get to make a couple of small adjustments there, but I think that this is going to be the first hose. Okay, now refining my technique even more now that I've found these things. What I'm going to do is heat up this heat shrink so that it's tight around the wire, while leaving a little bit of wire exposed on the outside. Give me my mounting point. And now that the heat shrink is tight around the wire, I'll be able to make all the bends I need to make without worrying too much about the hose kinking. There we go. And I have my little lead there that I can use to insert into the radiator. Should have been how I did the other one from the beginning, but hey, it's a learning process. Okay, so now we just have to cut it. Let's see, we're gonna need to go from there to there. So we're gonna cut it to here. And then we'll work our way down from there. Okay, we have our first hose is already figured out. Right there. Now we have to figure out our second hose, which is going to involve going in at an angle this way. So we're going to glue it into the radiators like so. And we're going to use our stronger super glue to get a better bond. This tester super glue from Hobby Lobby is one of my favorites. Oh, hold on, we're almost ran out of battery power. This is a fantastic super glue. Works on everything and is a super strong bond. So now we're going to insert our super glue into the hole right there. we are going to install our pin and hose there, and we're going to set that aside to dry. Then we're going to add some more super glue here. And we're going to install our second radiator hose. Okay guys, and here we have it, both of our radiator hoses installed in our radiator. So now we have the look of real rubber hoses. Now just a little bit of bare metal foil to make the clamps on the hoses, and we will be done. A little bit of touch-up paint is also going to work too. So that's one and done. Alright guys, we have the completed assembly here. This is our entire radiator and fan assembly all together. I've just finished putting the radiator hose clamps on the hoses. You can see that there. Now, I did that by just cutting thin strips of bare metal foil and wrapping them around the radiator hoses to simulate the clamps. So we have our hoses, we have our clamps, we have our fan assembly installed. Our radiators all, can we zoom in on that? Let's see. No, camera's not cooperating. There it is right there. You can see by using the aluminum in very light dusting how some of the black shows through, which gives you a much more realistic appearance of the radiator than had it been all completely painted aluminum. For example, let's take a look at this one that was built by someone I knew a while back, a long time ago. And you can see the difference between this radiator and this one, and how this one has a much more realistic appearance because you can't see the black showing through the silver like you would in a real radiator, where you would see the dark spaces in between the fins. Where on this one it's all silver, so it just kind of looks like a painted radiator. Here I tried a little bit of black wash on it to try and see if I can bring some of the details out. Not too successful. So now this entire assembly is going to go into the car. This went from a simple 3-piece assembly to a 5-piece assembly, including the hoses, and quite a complex little thing for what it is. So now we're going to install it in the car and go ahead with installing our suspension. Okay, we're back at it. We're going to glue in the coolant pipes. Very simple procedure. We're just going to take our fancy toothpick, very special tool, and we're just going to apply super glue into the channel here where the pipe goes, and right here. And we're going to take our coolant pipe and install it with the 2 pins. Oops, sorry, 2 pins there. I don't know if you guys can see them, they're so small, but they are there. And we're going to use them just to insert the coolant pipe right there. Then we'll do a little accelerator action. This stuff is the best thing to happen to super glue ever. Yeah. As the drying time really speeds up. Matter of fact, speeds up so much that it's instant. It's already done. All right, now let's just get rid of this tape that we used to measure everything with. Now the next thing we're going to install is our radiator, which goes into the radiator bracket here, which we saw installed previously. Okay, now that is going to require a little more liberal use of the super glue. Let me tell you, this tester super glue is fantastic. I love it. I never thought that it would become one of my favorites, but it is. As it goes on, has a super hard bond. That'll be on the bottom of the radiator mounting bracket there. And a little bit there. Okay, so now run our hoses in, install our radiator right there. Is perfection. Okay, there and there. Building a few of these kits is that the radiators never quite fit the same in any one of these kits for some reason. I don't know if the chassis gets warped since it's been sitting in the box for so many years. I'm not really sure what it is, but every single one that I've done, the radiator has fit just a little bit different in each one. That's it. Can't tell you why. It just happens. And putting our accelerator on there. Hold it for a second. And now our radiator assembly is installed. You can see how it lines up with the coolant lines, the coolant pipes. Almost perfect alignment. Much better than I did on the first car because now I kind of know what I'm doing. Kind of. Now we can install the subframe, which will cover our coolant pipes. Or the joining of the coolant pipes and our hoses. Now that's going to be another use of our super glue. We're going to put a bit here and a notch where and then we're just going to install our front subframe one shot. Our front subframe is installed and done. Our radiator is installed. Our cooling system is in. And now all we have to do is install the front suspension. And we'll be done with this portion of the chassis build. The front of the chassis anyway. We still got quite a bit of work to do on the rear. So let's just take a look here and see exactly how we're going to get this to go in where we want it. With the springs, it becomes a bit more of a challenge to get it where we want it. Because now the springs are taking up some of the room that we need to install this part. And there it is in up, and that snapped again. That is going to be a problem, as the rack here did snap. We might have to do a little bit of creative repair work there. Now, the first thing we're going to have to do is open up these mounting holes a little bit. Holy cow, I didn't realize that. This hadn't dried yet, so I just pulled the subframe right off of the car. Good job. And I just popped the cooling line off. Okay, guys. Remember that we had a conversation about patience being a virtue once before? Okay, guys. Had to finish the installation of the front suspension off camera, as I ran into a few minor little issues. And the juggling I had to do to get all these parts to line up together was a little difficult to do when I'm trying to keep everything in a camera frame. So I'm just going to tell you what I did. It's very the same as we've done on the other two cars. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 contact points. Well, actually, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 contact points for the steering gear as it mounts onto the subframe. Also had to glue down the control arm to the spindle, lower control arm to the spindle, so that we have a completed front end without anything hanging out in empty space. You can see we have the springs installed. Now getting the springs to stay in place while I'm installing the steering gear was a little bit of a juggling act. That's part of the problem that I had. Also, with the radiator hoses now in place, they take up a little bit more space than the original plastic parts did. But I managed to work around that. The only issue I had, which is something you want to be aware of when building this kit, the connection from the rack here to where the sway bar is, two very thin pieces of plastic that hold this to there, so they can snap very easily, as this one did as I was installing it. Now repairing it's going to be relatively easy, so we're just going to fix that. Probably just put a small piece of sprue in there, use some Tamiya to hold it, some Tamiya fine glue to hold it in, and then just paint it all. You won't even notice that it was there. So it's not that big of a deal. So now we have our front end completely finished. I'm really happy with the way that came out, as all those red parts in there really set off the car and will really look like what Romaldo has in his car. I have posted a few images of what he has, but I'm going to put another picture right about there, showing you all the red parts that he put in this thing that I'm trying to emulate as best I can. So we are moving right along. The next step is to start installing the rear suspension, which is going to start with the rear subframe. So we're going to keep going and till we finish this chassis. Okay, guys, now we're into step 7. Right there, you guys can see that. Step 7, installing the subframe and the exhaust. Pretty much the same thing we saw on the other build, so we're just going to go ahead and do that. The one difference I'm going to do is that I am going to install the exhaust first onto the subframe instead of doing it in the order they want you to do it, which is installing the subframe first, then the exhaust. Because it really doesn't make a difference. The catalytic converter is going to sit one way and one way only, which means that the muffler is going to sit one way and one way only. So it's just easier to put it together this way and then just drop it right into the car. So we're going to go ahead and build this rear section of the car. No need to go real in-depth into that. So just hang out while I put this together. There we go. The exhaust is done. Cradle's in. Quick and easy peasy. Now we're going to let everything set up and dry so we don't make the same mistakes we made before. And we'll be back. Guys, we're at the spray booth, and I figured I'd try something I haven't tried before for the suspension components. Spraying some decanted paint through the airbrush. Now, I'm using TS49 for the red accents on the rear suspension of the car. And here I have a bottle of the TS49, well, some TS49 in this Tamiya paint bottle, which has been in here for quite a while. And let me tell you something, these Tamiya paint bottles are great. They really seal well. This paint's been in here for well over a couple of months and it's still good as new. So anyway, I decanted it by simply spraying it into this bottle, and until I have found an opportunity to use it. So today I've been playing with it. I did paint the struts. We have to remove the mask so you can see that I've painted the springs. Hopefully it didn't bleed through. And we'll get a better look at that when we're back inside. And then I decided to play with, since this is my first time spraying decanted paint, I figured I would, let's see if we can see this. This is part of a Fujimi Ferrari Dino, an old kit which had seen better days, and I use it for testing purposes. So I decided to spray the Tamiya TS49 Bright Red onto this part of the Fujimi car, and look at that. Look at the shine on that. Now, this is on an unprepared part. This thing had tons of paint on it because I use it to test various things before I paint. And so I just decided I'm just going to spray over whatever was here and see how it comes out. And look at the shine on that. So airbrushing decanted paint really does work. I've seen a lot of guys swear by it. I've never tried it before, so I figured this time I'll just give it one shot and see what happens. And take a look at that. So I'm going to have to experiment with that a bit more. And maybe I'll be decanting all of my paints, as it's a much more efficient use of paint, first of all, because you're spraying a lot less. You're wasting a lot less. Let me put it that way. And it lays really, really nicely. I mean, it looks a little rough, but that's because what's underneath it was completely rough. But if you look at the shine on there, it actually leveled out really nicely for what I'm doing with it. Really interesting experiment. For me, anyway, because I've never done this before. If any of you guys out there haven't done it either, then I guess you'll find this interesting too. All right, let's get back to the build. Hit that camera again. Okay, guys, now back to the least favorite part of doing this type of work is the masking and then the unmasking. So let's start taking this apart and see if this actually worked. guys. We have our struts done with our red springs. Let's give us a good look at that. Came out exactly the way I wanted to. Now, as you're only going to see the front of the spring, I'm not really concerned with what happened in the back, but that is going to look fantastic in the car. This one here is going to need a little bit more cleaning up, but I think it's going to work out nicely. Very happy with this. As a matter of fact, the spring perch at the bottom being red. I think I kind of like it. Although, I'm going to have to see. But there we go. Now we have the struts painted and done up. Now to let that cure before I mess with it any further. Alright guys, we're going to take a quick look at the axle assembly. You can see here I did all the detail painting on the rear. You can see how the springs on the struts came out. And I simulated the knuckle back there. As you can see in the photos of Ronaldo's car, he painted all the knuckles red. So what I did was I just painted in the areas where the knuckle would be, as the model doesn't really represent them very well. And so that when you look at it, you can see that there is a steering knuckle back there, holding the axle in the center, the tie rod on the sides, and then the black area is the dust shield for the brake rotor. And then you see the caliper, which was washed in a little bit of Tamiya panel line paint. And then we have the boots in Tamiya rubber black, and a little bit of brass for the end fitting of the tie rod. Did the same thing on both axles, and now getting ready to install them, which you guys have seen on the other video. On the blue chassis, so we're not going to go over that whole thing here. But here you can see, if you can, the strut installed, and you can see how the springs look painted up. And even though you really can't see much of that knuckle that I painted back there, it's just kind of cool that it is. You can kind of peek at it if you go in there with a microscope and, you know, peek around the back. So here we have the strut. I think he has KYBs in the rear, which are a metallic gray color, so that's why I painted the struts that way, with the knuckle, with the red knuckle, which is part of the spindle assembly, and the red springs. So we're gonna go ahead and install the other side, and that will complete the chassis assembly. Okay guys, and this is the end of the chassis of Fiero Red. You can see the engine's installed, everything sits in there nicely. As a matter of fact, the engine fit much better than it did in Fiero Blue, or even in the test shot Fiero. Don't know why that is, but there just seemed to be more room as I built everything the same as far as I can remember. We have a nice polished exhaust there. This is made with the Alclad paint. There you can see everything installed. There's the rear suspension with our painted springs, which we did with our first attempt at decanting paint, which worked out really, really nicely. Lower control arms painted red. Here we have the upper and lower control arms, the sway bar painted red. So I performed a little repair on the steering rack, but it's not really a big deal. Our coil springs came out really nice. If we can focus in on that, let's focus. Let's see if we can get that to focus so we can show you guys a little bit better. There we go. There go our coil springs in our front suspension, which came out fantastic. Everything's got a nice high glossy red coat, just like the parts in Ronaldo's car. We will be fixing that. But as you can see, everything's in. We have all of our radiator hoses and stacked. Came out really, really nice. I think the second one actually came out better than the first, since I had already ironed out all of the bugs in all the modifications with Fiero Blue, so that Fiero Red came out even better. But overall, I'm happy with both. As you can see here, all the differences between Fiero Red and Fiero Blue, really making the cars stand out from each other, at least on the chassis. So why don't we take a look at the three of them together. And what do you think, guys? I'm very happy with the results so far. And this will close out the build of the chassis for all three cars. Alright, guys. We're going to leave it at that and continue with this build in the next episode, where we'll be moving on to doing more body work. Alright, guys. I'll see you on the next one.